Welcome to an Adobe Illustrator tutorial for scientists. So chances are, if you have started to try and make your own scientific paper for the first time, or maybe you're trying to get some practice in Illustrator, you probably need some help in terms of navigating and figuring out what the heck to do in this program. It's very powerful. It's typically used by graphic designers, but it's also very useful to scientists. So the whole purpose of this tutorial is to have an extensive kind of one-stop shop for any scientist, whether you're a first-year graduate student, a postdoc, or even a PI, to really understand all the things that you can do in Adobe Illustrator that are quite specific to scientists. So getting into it, something that I was learning during COVID was that most of the tutorials online are for graphic designers, and they have extensive depth of knowledge of all the ins and outs of design, of Illustrator, and this didn't really have a lot of applicability to what I needed to make for a figure. So what I wanted to do was kind of compile all of the dozens to hundreds of tutorials that I've watched into something that I think is very valuable for scientists, which is a completely different skill set than what designers need. Designers need Illustrator for making branding, like texturizing a logo, learning how to do typeface and spacing letters. There's so many things that designers need to know about that scientists don't. So for better or worse, there's actually fewer things as a scientist you need to know in Illustrator, but I want you to know all those things very thoroughly. So this is really to try to be a complete Illustrator tutorial for any level scientist. Another thing is I want you to be able to build a solid technical foundation for knowing how to make a scientific figure. Normally, the way people will go about learning something in Illustrator is they learn just enough to do a thing that was kind of struggling. There was something that was kind of holding them back, or they needed to know how to snap a figure or trim something or make a shape. And then that's kind of all that they learned how to do. So their skill set builds out really slowly. What I want you to do is be able to watch this and have a really big skill set from the very beginning and also understand things like best practices. So something that I also want to share is how to establish something like a lab-wide best practice for making figures. So this includes things like how to make a template, and how to choose and generate color palettes. And these are things that I think are actually really nice if you're something like a new PI and you're setting up a lab. Starting with a nice, well-defined Illustrator template that you will share with all of your students and postdocs will be immensely beneficial going forward. You will have a unified design language from everyone in your lab, and it also takes out a lot of the guesswork. What font do I want to use? What size do I want to use? What are our graphs going to look like? So understanding that you can make a template and then just share that out with your organization, whether you're in industry or in academia, understanding what these best practices are is really going to make it so much easier for you when you're writing papers, you're reviewing things that your students are submitting you, and understanding that everyone's starting on the same playing field. There's no more guesswork in terms of where do they start, because they're going to be new as well. And last but not least, a lot of people in academia don't want to acknowledge this, but your lab is a brand. I know that having something be a brand sounds too much like industry, but in all honesty, having something like a cohesive design language or how you establish your graphs, what is the minimum expectation for how refined your figures look? If I had to guess, I would state that the top tier publications, the science isn't necessarily 5 times better than the next tier down, but their figures are on point. Their figures are very well crafted. And really understanding some basics in graphic design, I'm going to try and help you establish what are some small little tricks that can go a long way in terms of improving the readability, ease of understanding of your figures, and really just making everything more cohesive and clean in the hopes that you are able to make better figures. And that just makes it that much easier to get into a higher tier journal. So for general tips for Adobe Illustrator, the number one, honestly, is just use a mouse. Tons of students have a laptop, obviously, and maybe they have a Bluetooth mouse. If you do not use a mouse when you are using Illustrator, you'll end up playing what I call finger twister, like the board game, on your trackpad. You're going to be clicking and holding and dragging, holding Alt or Option and Command and Shift and all these things, and dragging with precision when you have to press down and move your finger on a trackpad, it just doesn't work. So number one recommendation is get a Bluetooth mouse or a wired mouse, whatever. It's going to make your job so much easier. Again, this is not for graphic designers who will use like a stylus or something because they're doing all this hand drawn curves and everything. This is just for scientists who basically work in orthogonal increments and stuff, so just get a mouse. Number 2 is learn hotkeys. So seconds make up minutes, make up hours. If you put in the time to learn hotkeys, you will be able to fly so much faster and get a figure done in a fraction of the time. The third one is this really big idea in graphic design. It's this idea of keep it live, aka pixels cost you nothing when you're designing something in software. So you'll see this little image on the right. I went and I had made this cartoonized version of an objective of a microscope, and this was kind of the final product. If you turn on the other layers of all that I was working on, you'll see that I had all these things that I was just goofing around with, trying to get things that looked good. Do I want more cartoon shading? Do I want a 3D revolve and stuff? But I have all these things saved. And we'll talk about this in the future for best practices. But working non-destructively is a huge idea that is going to pay massive dividends if you just make your figures right from the get-go. By that I mean correctly. This idea of working non-destructively, when in doubt, copy, paste, and move it over, and then start working on a new thing. You have unlimited pixels, so don't just have everything be made destructively on one artboard. The other one is move in orthogonal directions and known increments. So you'll notice that everything on this little graphic on the right-hand side, it's all kind of evenly spaced in terms of kind of like this grid pattern. And that's because every time I make a new copy of something to work on, I just copy it and shift it over 10, 20, 50, 100 pixels or whatever, and it makes it way easier to snap things back into place perfectly. I see a lot of people when they're kind of new to Illustrator, they copy, maybe they click and drag, and that's way less easily replicable because you're moving at kind of an unknown increment by just moving your mouse. If you move in orthogonal increments with your keyboard, you don't have to worry about snapping as much. Another one is avoid working in what I call a mega layer. This is definitely a litmus test for whether or not someone's quite experienced to Illustrator or any type of thing like Photoshop or not. So if someone's asking me, hey, can you take a look at my figure? They'll normally show me what they're working on. And the first thing I do is I look at their layers panel. If their layers panel, it just says layer 1 and everything is on that layers panel, I know that they're not too familiar with Illustrator, because what does this also imply is that they're working destructively. The only things that you can see on that artboard, for the most part, are really just what's on layer 1. So we'll talk about best practices for how to use layers to your advantage. And really, this combines with the keep it live idea, is if you don't like something, if you make a version of it that you didn't like, you don't have to delete it. Just move it to a different layer and then hide that layer. So we'll talk about that in the future. And lastly, the idea is embedding images. So this really becomes important the second you start collaborating with other students, other PIs, is the concept of embedding images, where normally if you just click and drag something into Illustrator, it's going to remember the file location on your computer. And so if I share this Illustrator file with Sarah and I have a picture in there that was from my Dropbox or whatever, it's going to throw an error when Sarah opens up the figure that I send her. It says, I don't have that image. So we'll talk about the importance of embedding images to make sure that your collaborators can actually work on the figures together. So some general tips. These are really just what I was learning from watching a lot of people in graphic design, is this really nice idea is that there's no such thing as a complex shape. Complex shapes are actually just many basic shapes. This is a really good piece of news for scientists because it means that you don't have to be an artist to make things that are more than just a square or a circle. So I'll give this example to illustrate what I'm talking about. This is just a bunch of circles. They may be arranged in kind of an artistic manner, but they're still at the end of the day just a bunch of circles. You will recognize what this turns into. This is actually what the Twitter logo is. So you have all these different circles, maybe how they proportion them or how they place them was a little bit artistic. But this idea that everything is a basic shape, and things that are complex shapes are normally just combinations of many basic shapes together. So we'll also go through how do I make a more complex shape by combining, fusing, and trimming multiple basic shapes with something like the Pathfinder tool or the Shape Builder tool. There's another idea that is kind of good for when you're in doubt of what to do. So there's this idea of just golden ratio. You've probably seen this kind of like Fibonacci circle or the Fibonacci curves, and you get things like this kind of like bullseye pattern if you just stack all these circles together. If you are to remember one number from all of today, this whole tutorial, it's 1.618. Just try to remember that you're like 16, 18 or something. If you are unsure of how much smaller or how much bigger to make a duplicate of something, multiply or divide it by 1.618. Normally that gives you something that's in good proportion to the thing that you just copied from. So if you're making like a smaller cell or a bigger cell or whatever, start by just using that number. I think you'd be surprised as to how nice certain things can come out. But that's pretty much the only number that you'll have to remember for this whole tutorial, 1.618. That golden ratio, that 1.618, is actually seen really commonly throughout design, particularly logo design. This was something, as I was digging into graphic design, I grew immense respect for are designers who are able to make a memorable, impactful logo that is simple and beautiful. So, for example, you can see how complex the Apple logo is. You don't have to make something that crazy. But even something as beautifully simple as the National Geographic logo, it's just a rectangle, but the ratios of A to B are in that golden ratio. I wanted to give you a few seconds to read this slide because it highlights what I want to talk about next, and that is text hierarchies. So most likely you read the part in that middle first that says you will read this first, and so on and so forth. This concept that we're going to talk about for a minute or two is called hierarchies, and I think it is really important, and it actually translates really well to making good scientific papers, and specifically graphs and other figures. So this is a huge concept that I don't think any scientist is explicitly taught about in something like an engineering curriculum. So we're going to play a little game. I want to show you how important hierarchies are, but I want you to raise your hand when you can see and find the name of the medication on the bottle, okay? So we'll do this in 3, 2, 1. Normally around now is when someone's found it. I would say it normally takes people anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds to find the name of the medication. I think it's Vicodin, so it's down here. This is a good example of when something is designed very poorly. So even though this is some example medication for Frank Sinatra, you don't know where to look in terms of what is guiding you. The biggest thing here is the name of the pharmacy. You don't care about the name of the pharmacy. You care about what medication it is, what's the dosage, when do I take this thing. You don't really care about the fax number of your pharmacy. So a lot of the things that have been changing for the better are realizing that hierarchies can make this safer. So if you have something like an older person with bad sight, them not being able to identify medication is not just inconvenient, these things become dangerous. So we're going to play the same game again. I want you to raise your hand when you can find the name of the medication just like before, okay? 3, 2, 1. Normally this is all that it takes, because the bottle on the right uses hierarchies way better than the one on the left. This is something that I really want to highlight when it comes to making better scientific figures, is things like hierarchies allow you to structure the importance of information. I want you to notice the actual information between the left and the right bottles really hasn't changed. It's still got pharmacy, an address, the name of your physician, quantities, etc. But what you care about most jumps out to you first. So amoxicillin 500 milligram and when to take it. If you need to know the name of the pharmacy, it's there, the medication number, all that stuff. The bottle on the right is just way better designed, and it's safer. This is going to tie back into what I'm going to talk about in a little bit about making things like graphs and figures, is this idea of using hierarchies to make your figures easier to read. This was something that I actually found in a stairwell at my university. So if you look at this, you will be probably very confused. I want you to stare at this for like 3 seconds and realize what the problem with this sign is, okay? Have you ever been in a stairwell and cared about the number of the stairwell more than you cared about the level floor you were on? Unless you're a firefighter, probably not. So this is a great example of when a hierarchy in real life can make things really, really difficult to use. But I took a stab at redoing this, where I tried to prioritize what you care about in something like a stairwell sign, where you want to know what floor you're on first and foremost. We start that on the left-hand side. You normally read either left to right, top to bottom. So again, the important thing is what floor you're on, and I wanted that to take up the most space. And then I've tried to condense what was just pure text over into a graphical format. So I have something like where the basement is, the little dot symbolizing where you are, and the exit. All the information, again, just like the pill bottles, all the information is still there. It's just arranged differently in the order that you should really be caring about it. So that's a big thing with hierarchies, and that's how you can make things a little more easy to understand when it comes to your papers, as what are you trying to get across first so that they understand subsequent things within a figure. So we've been talking about hierarchies, and why hierarchies? Well, I've been mentioned a couple times, is to make better graphs. So the overall idea here, you make better graphs or better figures, you will get better reviews on your papers that you submit to journals for review, and you will get into higher impact journals. If you make something that's easy for the reviewer to go through, the likelihood that they get frustrated is very, very low. So an example, I had found this graph on the left-hand side. I just found this in a journal somewhere, and I thought this was a really good example of, I think that this thing can be improved knowing what I know about hierarchies. So if you look at this image, there's certain things about it, like things aren't centered. Why are there these braces here? The orientation of these axis labels doesn't make sense. The colors, there's red and blue, but these are two different values, and I don't really know which one corresponds to what. So I took a stab at redesigning this one. The information is still the same between the left and the right. What's changed is how much easier it is to understand what's going on. Information is still the same. It's there if you want to dig into it. Probably the biggest thing people want when they look at a graph, in my opinion, is to understand a trend. What trend is happening on this graph? And then they'll normally dig into details like looking at the units, looking at the axis labels and other things. We talked about embedding images on a previous slide. So this is just a little example of what it will physically look like in Illustrator. So if I have something like this little heart over here, we'll talk about this when we actually get into Illustrator, is you have a picture of a heart and it's got this little chain link icon here. And so this is something that's important to notice, is that a chain link icon means that it's linked. So this is going to my Dropbox or somewhere on my computer, and it's just putting it in each time. This is a bad thing because mostly scientists work collaboratively. If you're a graphic designer, normally you're just the one in charge of making that brewery's logo or something. So yeah, it becomes convenient if you make changes and they propagate. But if you're working collaboratively, it's much easier if you just embed images so everyone can see the figures you're working on as you're drafting them. Something that is also pretty important is, how do we actually get a nice groundwork for a brand new lab or an established lab that's looking to make things smoother, is to always start from a template. When in doubt, make a template, not just for you, but for your students and for your postdocs, etc. If you're making this for the first time, there's no better time to start than now. So an idea for making a good template for all of your Illustrator figures is to first start by doing something like making a colorblind friendly color palette. There are a lot of journals now who are making more and more recommendations or even requirements that your figures need to be colorblind friendly. This means avoiding a graph with red, green only on it, and other things of that nature. There's different types of color blindness, and we can actually check for them all. We'll show you how to do that. Another one is you as the PI or the lead of the lab, you can choose what your typical graph layout should be. How big do you want your fonts? How do you want that to look? And you can copy and paste a typical graph that you like into the side into your style guide in Illustrator. We can show you how to do that, just so any new student can open up this style guide, this formatting guide, and understand where to start. How do you like to put, for example, different color channels on your scientific figures? If you have a confocal image with like 4 different fluorescent channels, how do you like to actually label your channels, your colors, what fonts, positions, etc.? So as long as you have an example and a style guide, really helps new students. Another one is this idea of building journal-specific templates. So you go to Science, you go to Nature, I'll use those two as the main examples, or any of those subsidiary journals. They will have guidelines for what they want when you submit a figure. So a big difference, for example, is Nature wants RGB style color palettes when you're making color choices. We can get into that. Versus Science, they want CMYK. CMYK is for print because, to my knowledge, all scientific journals published in Science get printed. So that's why they want you to submit your actual figures in a CMYK color palette. And if you don't know what either of these means, don't worry about it. Other things that are on those types of guidelines are your maximum and minimum text size. It will normally say no text smaller than size 5 font. And so you can have this stuff over on the side of your basic template whenever a student opens up to make a new figure, and they don't have to worry about this. They can just go over, copy, paste their minimum text size, and they know that they're fine. This is what a figure template that I like to use looks like. So you'll notice a few things. First of all, it's not a blank canvas. Anytime someone in your lab is like, I need to make a new draft of a figure or a new thing for an abstract, always open the template that you've made first, save it as a new file, and then start working. So every single time I make a new figure in Illustrator, I basically look at this every single time and save as new. So we'll go through a few of the important things on this document. Another benefit of starting with a template is that you know that the scale of your images is going to be basically correct from the very beginning. You've probably had it if you're a new student or a new user to Illustrator, where you make a cell or you draw a little diagram, you export the image, and then you put it in something like PowerPoint, and it's either tiny or it's massive. And you're thinking, how the heck did I make an image that small? It's because you probably just opened up a blank canvas and just started drawing somewhere. You had no frame of reference for scale, so you probably just zoomed in really far on this artboard, made your little cell icon, exported it, and so unbeknownst to you, you were actually making a tiny little cell as opposed to something that was more legible and you've had to click and drag and rescale it. If you're starting with a template every single time, you kind of know the general size of what you're making, so that's another benefit. And you can see the major things on this panel on the right-hand side. That's really the meat of the template, of the style guide. I have the archetypal lines and boxes and everything that I want a student to know, where this is how we like to do our dash boxes, etc. We'll get into this when we actually open up Illustrator. But the key takeaway is always start a new figure by opening a template. Start from a template and you can't go wrong. It makes it so much easier for people to start learning how to use Illustrator. And you always have consistency between students. So I talked about the idea of colorblind friendly palettes, but it's this idea of using Adobe's color wheel. So Adobe Color Wheel will help us make a color palette in like a minute. And then you pick colors you like and you put them in your Illustrator template and you're good to go. You start with colors, we'll adjust the color wheel, we'll show that in a second, and then we can validate that it is colorblind friendly safe. So really quickly, we will hop over to Adobe Illustrator to do that. And when you have the colors you like, you can just save them as hex codes or put them into Illustrator. But we'll hop over to Adobe's website to look at their color palette tool. Okay, so we opened up Adobe's color wheel on their website based off of the link that I had also put in the PowerPoint. And you'll notice that I have 5 major colors here. And the one that is most important is the one that has this little chevron in the middle. It's the middle of the 5. This is the one that also controls the unified amount of saturation. So if I'm dragging in that middle one, I'm clicking and holding now, it's making everything more or less saturated in a pretty even nature. You can individually select things, but if I want to evenly saturate or desaturate my colors, I grab that one with the little chevron, just something to note. So over here, what's kind of cool, and the reason that I like using this thing is that, let's say I want to make a color palette like this, and say you're a PI and your favorite color is kind of like a lavender. You can come over here and you can say, I want a lavender color, kind of like that. And you've got this nice spacing, thanks to Adobe software just doing the work for you, that lets you get your 5 major colors for any color palette. So you can either make things a little more saturated, you can make things a little more washed out. I typically recommend against having a really, really saturated color here. I think that's actually really hard on the eyes. I would recommend kind of backing off a little bit to where it's quite distinct, but you still get a little bit of softness. So once you have a color that you like, you can just play around with these, by the way. It doesn't really matter. I can go over here, I can adjust these guys. Say you've got your color palette to where you want. The next thing to do is to come over to here. It says accessibility tools. You'll open up a different page. That's fine. It's still saved on the other one, don't worry. And then on the left-hand side right here, it says contrast checker. I want you to click on that. And then it opens up a different drop-down menu, colorblind safe. So we open up this. This is the color panel or the color palette from that previous page over here on our color wheel. You will notice that it is not giving us any errors. It says no conflicts found. Swatches are colorblind safe. So that's great. If I like this color palette, I can save it. There's lots of things over here. Save, export. I can, write down the hexadecimal codes for all these. It doesn't matter. If you had a problem, or what is really common, so say I'm dragging this over, you may have had this occur, where you see this little white line between these two different colors because they're very similar. And it's throwing you an error because it says A and D are in conflict. So there's three major types of color blindness, and it's letting you know for at least, I guess in this case, two of them, these yellow and greens are so close, it's not really distinguishable for someone with a certain type of color blindness to see that. So if you have this little white line here, click and drag and separate these. So that wasn't enough. Maybe I want my green to be a little more blue, still not enough. Drag it back a little bit over, still not enough. Keep going, and then you're fine. So this is how you can create when you're making your template and you're making your lab's core color palette to make sure that whenever you have a graph with like 5 different lines on it, anyone can see it. So with that, let's actually go over to Illustrator. This was a general outline of principles of graphic design. I know you've probably been wondering where the heck's the Illustrator. This is an Illustrator tutorial, so let's hop over.